What happens when a CEO buys a car at his own dealership and hears something that makes him stop cold? Daniel Reeve, the CEO of Reeve Auto, a respected mid-size car dealership chain with 22 locations, had spent 2 decades building his brand on trust, transparency, and service. He believed every customer deserved respect, whether they were buying a luxury sedan or a used compact. Stories of pushy sales tactics, misleading pricing, and dismissive treatment of certain customers were spreading online. Daniel's senior managers brushed it off as internet noise, but Daniel wasn't so sure. Determined to see things for himself, he went undercover, clean-shaven and dressed down, posing as an everyday buyer. He walked into one of his busiest locations, browsed the lot, and began the paperwork for a modest fee. But just as he approached the front desk, 2 customers behind him started whispering, and what he heard made his heart drop. The elderly couple clutched each other's hands as the sales manager coldly dismissed the sentimental value of their late son's car, offering them less than half its worth. What the manager didn't know, the awkward new employee watching from across the showroom floor wasn't just any employee. He was Daniel Reeve, the owner of the entire dealership chain. I spent 3 weeks investigating what happens when a CEO goes undercover in his own company. The results reveal not just one corrupt manager, but an entire system that rewards predatory sales tactics, and the dramatic confrontation that changed everything when Daniel finally revealed his true identity. Daniel Reeve had worked in pristine offices for as long as he could remember, meetings surrounded by polished glass walls, deep leather chairs, and a sense of authority that followed him everywhere. That was his world. Standing now in the bustling sales floor of one of his dealerships, wearing jeans and a cheap polo, that world felt a million miles away. He wasn't Daniel anymore. He was Eric, an awkward new hire with an oversized name tag and a pair of stiff loafers that pinched his ankles. The disguise was minimal. He ditched his neatly cropped beard, let his hair sit a little messily, and traded his usual sharp suits for the plainest clothes he could find. He hoped it would be enough. Blending in, at least on the surface, was easy. Most of the employees had never seen the CEO in person. To them, he was just some figure at corporate, the guy who signed the memos and sent emails with lofty mission statements. Here, Eric was just another new recruit expected to learn the ropes. And that's when the first cracks in the facade of the company began to show. Simple things, like the onboarding process, seemed unnecessarily chaotic. He was handed paperwork that was outdated, clunky sales software that froze every few minutes, and instructions that were more barked orders than training. Eric fumbled with the paperwork, his fingers clumsy as he tried to navigate forms he'd personally approved months ago but had never actually handled. The seasoned employees watched with barely concealed amusement. "Looks like you've never held a pen before," one of them joked casually, leaning over his shoulder. Daniel chuckled as naturally as he could, feeling the sting of the comment more strongly than he'd expected. Months ago, the corporate team had rolled out this new software, praising its efficiency, yet here it was, sluggish and riddled with confusing instructions. But the laughter of the staff was what struck him the most. It wasn't playful or dismissive. Brushing off his struggles, they ignored him entirely and returned to their conversations about weekend plans and a few particularly aggressive sales targets hanging over their heads. No one offered help. Daniel, the man used to calling the shots, was now invisible. This invisibility, though uncomfortable, was exactly what he needed. He let himself drift into the background, observing the interactions around him. Conversations were quick, clipped, and agitated. A strange energy seemed to hum in the air, an undercurrent of impatience mixed with anxiety. Salespeople moved with polite but mechanical tones, and every word felt rehearsed. Daniel overheard words like upsells and quotas slipped into conversations. He began to notice how rigid the hierarchy was here. Junior staff seemed petrified of stepping out of line, while senior employees like the sales manager commanded the floor with curt authority. The focus wasn't on customer satisfaction, it was on numbers. In his previous life as Daniel, his meetings with leadership always painted an optimistic picture. Every presentation from his management team boasted statistics about high closing rates, stellar profits, and efficient workflows. Yet standing here as Eric, those presentations felt meaningless. He saw the real picture. The tension on the floor came from policies he hadn't intended but had grown under his watch. How many other executives, Daniel thought, assumed that the numbers balanced out to a healthy environment? He thought back to a report from a few months ago, a detailed analysis about how gaps between leadership and operations result in blind spots, allowing problems to fester unnoticed. On his first day shadowing a senior salesman, Daniel encountered one such blind spot face to face. Closing a deal wasn't just a task. It was an exhausting sales battle, one that left customers anxious and employees drained. His trainer prided himself on wringing every possible cent out of buyers. Daniel's attempts to inject soft questions or express real interest in the customer's needs were met with a raised eyebrow. "You're too slow with them," the salesman told him bluntly as they walked back to the break room. "It's about getting to the yes, that's it. You push, they fold." It wasn't advice, Daniel realized. It was the culture here. The brashness wasn't contained to one person. As Daniel wandered from desk to desk, he was treated like an amateur, and in many ways that's exactly how they viewed him. He fumbled introductions, bungled the simplest calculations on the sales system, and endured skeptical glances when he asked what seemed to them like obvious questions. "Fresh off the bus, huh?" one of the senior employees teased, shaking his head when Daniel misclicked on his computer for the third time that morning. What the staff didn't know was that every single misstep gave Daniel more insight into the environment they worked in, and the one he, unknowingly, had allowed to form. Looking around, he noticed more than just the strained expressions of the employees. There were customers, too, dotted throughout the showroom, carrying their own wariness. Couples stood whispering while checking price tags, wary of sales reps approaching them. One woman sat stiffly at a desk nearby, her frown deepening as a salesperson explained the loan terms, his voice low and abrupt. A version of this scene repeated itself over and over as Daniel maneuvered the floor that day. Though the deals got closed, the human connection he once envisioned for his dealerships seemed to have evaporated completely. Interacting with the team only sharpened his sense of how fragmented his vision had become. The business he built from scratch was supposed to be about trust and quality, values that stood apart from competitors. But here on the ground, those principles had decayed into just words on a wall. Employees were trained to aim for the highest profit margins, not to build relationships. Watching them push add-on and hidden costs onto customers with smiles that felt more forced than warm, he started to realize where every past complaint had come from. What he heard in leadership meetings about above-average satisfaction scores didn't align with what he was seeing now. And yet, the disconnect wasn't just in the policies themselves. Seeing it from the inside, Daniel grasped why so many CEOs are blindsided by cultural rot. It's hard to diagnose when you sit desks or entire cities away from the action. A recent industry stat had caught his attention before this undercover mission. Companies with disengaged frontline staff are twice as likely to underperform precisely because leadership often doesn't understand the struggles on the ground. As Daniel awkwardly stumbled through the day under the guise of Eric, those struggles stood out to him with painful clarity. But it wasn't until he saw a specific exchange at the far corner of the showroom that his discomfort turned into determination. It was subtle at first. A middle-aged couple approached the sales manager, keys in hand and hesitation evident in their posture. The manager leaned casually against his desk, his expression unreadable. From across the floor, Daniel's attention sharpened. There was something about their body language, the way they clutched the keys a little too tightly, that drew him in. What he saw next would confirm all his worst fears and unravel a story he couldn't ignore. Daniel's attention shifted to a corner of the showroom where an older couple stood clutching a single car key on one of those plain dealership keychains. The man, balding with a neat button-up shirt tucked into his worn trousers, glanced around nervously while the woman adjusted her purse strap, her grip tightening as if clinging to an anchor. They weren't here for a joyride or haggling over options like leather seats. There was no energy of excitement or routine negotiation. Instead, everything about them radiated unease. Daniel couldn't hear much from where he stood but caught brief snippets of their conversation with Rick Larson, the sales manager whose demeanor seemed as detached as the gray office chair he was leaning against. The couple wasn't trying to buy a car. They had come to trade in the car their son had once owned, his pride and joy before a terrible accident had taken him away just months earlier. Daniel watched as Rick barely glanced up from his tablet, responding to their words with an air of impatience. The husband explained how the car represented more than just transportation. It was one of the last tangible threads linking them to their son. They had hoped they could honor his memory by trading it in for a fair value, something they could put toward easing their financial troubles from medical expenses. Their voices had the slight tremble of someone asking for meaningful help, unsure whether they'd receive it or a brush off. Rick's posture never shifted. He didn't soften or even muster a neutral kindness most would give as a default courtesy. His tone sounded clipped, almost automatic, like flipping through a script. "We can do 2,000 tops," Daniel heard him say flatly, loud enough that it cut above the hum of chatter on the busy sales floor. The husband blinked in disbelief while the wife, clearly shaken, opened her mouth as if to protest but hesitated. She tightened her grip on the keys instead, holding onto them as if letting go now would somehow sever the last link to their son. Rick folded his arms, clearly not expecting any resistance. Daniel recognized the gesture Rick made next. Leaning forward slightly, resting one hand on his desk, the man was delivering the universal language of unyielding negotiations. It was a power move, one carefully designed to shut down the couple's emotions by projecting authority. "We really can't push it higher than that," Rick added with a shrug, punctuating his words with a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. Everything about his stance, tone, and phrasing was calculated not to sympathize, but to press forward and close the deal quickly. The woman finally spoke. Her voice was soft, barely audible from across the floor where Daniel stood, but the strain in her words cut through. She reminded Rick again that this car was a big piece of their son's life, one they weren't ready to part with unless it really helped them. Even from the distance, Daniel could see her hand tremble as she handed over a thin maintenance record book. Rick flipped through it lazily, nodding like he was skimming unimportant details. "They think things depreciate fast," he said, tossing the booklet back onto the desk. "At the end of the day, it's just an old compact car like any other. $2,000 is already stretching it." Daniel clenched his jaw. The detachment in Rick's words wasn't just unprofessional, it was cold. He wasn't evaluating anything about the car's actual worth. Instead, he was leveraging the couple's grief as a strategy to make them feel helpless. The lowball offer wasn't an oversight, it was a deliberate move to weaken their resolve until they reluctantly gave in. Rick's phrasing, the way he dismissed their sentiment, seemed ripped from some internal playbook of how to wear down vulnerable customers. It wasn't just callous, it reinforced why so many complaints about pushy tactics had surfaced recently. This was exactly the kind of behavior Daniel had feared but never wanted to believe existed in his dealerships. For Daniel, the idea of predatory sales practices wasn't theoretical anymore. It was playing out right in front of him. This wasn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet or an isolated incident. It was personal now. He knew how easily vulnerable customers, especially elderly ones, could be taken advantage of in situations like this. Predatory tactics don't just cost people money, they take a psychological toll. The stress, confusion, and feeling of being cornered can stay long after the sale. And here Rick was using every ounce of their pain for leverage. The woman whispered something to her husband, her eyes misting as she slid her hand over his arm, trying to comfort herself, or him. Daniel couldn't stand still anymore, Positioning himself as casually as he could manage, he closed the gap between himself and the sales desk. As he got closer, Rick barely glanced at him, busy tapping on his tablet as he rattled off a new set of numbers about monthly savings if they chose store credit instead of a trade. Daniel let the couple finish their quiet exchange before stepping forward. "Excuse me," he said, keeping his tone neutral. Rick frowned briefly and gave a half-hearted smile before turning his focus back on the elderly man, clearly prioritizing the people who held the keys. It was here Daniel's dual identities, Eric, the awkward trainee, and Daniel, the owner, clashed in his mind. He knew this was the moment he had to act. Of all the scenarios he thought he might face while undercover, responding to something this personal wasn't one he had prepared for. He cleared his throat lightly and forced a small, polite smile. "Would you mind if I took a quick look at the car?" he asked, directing the question more toward the couple than Rick while moving slightly closer to their side of the desk. The wife looked confused at first, almost startled that this bystander would interfere. But when Daniel explained he had some experience with vehicle valuation, her expression softened. Rick didn't even bother hiding his irritation. "I've already assessed it," he announced loudly in a clipped tone, clearly intended to shut Daniel out of the conversation. But Daniel didn't back down. He requested the car's details, the year, mileage, and condition, and began jotting down notes on the dealership pronounced notepad he carried as part of his training. At first, Rick rolled his eyes and let the charade play out, but as Daniel continued, he began to shift uneasily in his chair. After only a few moments of reviewing the information, Daniel looked at the couple and said something Rick hadn't expected. "This car looks to be in fantastic condition for its age," he began, his tone more deliberate now. "$5,000 at the very least would be a fair trade-in offer, and if you'd prefer, we'd even restore it, out of pocket so it stays in your family's memory." The couple froze, the wife's hand flying to her mouth as her husband blinked rapidly in disbelief. Tears welled in her eyes, but their gratitude was unmistakable. "You'd really do that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Rick, on the other hand, didn't mask his frustration anymore. His shoulders tensed as his frown deepened. "We can't just," he began, but Daniel cut him off, staring him down in a way that instantly silenced him. Though Rick didn't yet know who he was speaking to, there was authority behind Daniel's gaze that wasn't part of Eric's awkward employee persona. It was a rare glimpse of the CEO breaking through. Before Rick could regain his composure, Daniel assured the couple the new offer would be honored without hesitation. The relief that washed over them drained the tension from their faces, and the wife reached out to briefly touch Daniel's hand in appreciation. It was a simple gesture, small but sincere, as they walked away holding hands and smiling, promising to send over any additional documentation. Daniel spotted the glare Rick cast toward him. It wasn't just anger, it was deeper, more unsettled, like he knew this moment marked the start of something that wouldn't end in his favor. Behind the closed door of the sales office, the atmosphere shifted. The usual buzz of the showroom floor faded into muffled sounds, leaving Daniel and Rick Larson alone. Intense silence. Rick stood by his desk, his arms crossed, his movements slow but watchful, while Daniel sat in one of the worn chairs across from him, composed but visibly focused. For a moment, neither spoke. It was the kind of pause that felt deliberate, stretched too long to be comfortable. Then Daniel leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk, and broke the stillness. "I think we need to talk about what I just saw," he started, his tone calm but weighted. Rick straightened, his eyes narrowing slightly. He was clearly sizing up his supposedly new employee, unsure why a trainee would feel bold enough to call him into a meeting. But Daniel wasn't in the mood to waste time. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet, placing it on the desk with purpose. "Before we begin, I want to clarify something," Daniel said as he unfolded his corporate ID and slid it across to Rick. "I'm not Eric. I'm Daniel Reeve, the owner of this business." The weight of that sentence hit the room immediately. Rick blinked, his reaction mingling disbelief with a flash of panic that he couldn't suppress in time. He picked up the ID slowly, glancing at it before setting it back down without a word. His body language shifted, his usual confidence slipping. "You've been working under the assumption that nobody's paying attention here," Daniel continued, his voice even, just to himself. "But I've been watching." Rick's attempt to regain composure was almost visible as he forced himself to shrug lightly and offer a response. "Look," Rick started, his tone shifting to defensive as he gestured vaguely with his hands. "I don't know what this is supposed to prove. I'm doing my job. That's what you hired me for, right? To push sales, to hit targets." Daniel stayed silent, his unreadable expression prompting Rick to keep talking. "I mean, everything I do here is based on policy. Numbers are what keep a deleted like this running. You can't be competitive if you're not aggressive, you know. Besides," he added, his voice lowering slightly, "it's not like they'd get a better deal somewhere else." For a moment, Daniel said nothing, his eyes focused squarely on Rick. Then, finally, he leaned back and folded his arms. "Do you think what happened earlier, the way you handled that couple, is something we should be proud of?" Rick hesitated, his gaze darting to the side before settling back on Daniel. "Look, it's not personal," he said, his tone firmer now, trying to sound resolute. In truth, they were going to sell that car one way or another. I gave them a fair offer, considering market conditions and all. That wasn't a fair offer, and we both know it," Daniel cut in, his voice slightly sharper this time. Rick's mouth opened briefly, but Daniel didn't wait for a response. "You watched them struggle, you heard how much that car meant to them, and you used it to your advantage. That's not just unethical, it goes against everything this company is supposed to stand for," scoffed, shaking his head, a trace of irritation creeping into his voice. "Unethical, with all due respect, Mr. Reeve, it's not exactly a secret how this industry works. You're either selling or you're losing. You know that better than anyone. If you've got a problem with the way we close deals, maybe you should take it up with whoever wrote the policies." His meaning was clear. Rick believed Daniel's own leadership was at fault for setting this standard. Daniel let the words settle in the air for a moment before he responded. "You're absolutely right," he said, his tone softening slightly. "The problem does start with leadership. I failed to see what was happening here. I trusted management to uphold the values we built this company on: integrity, customer respect, fairness. Somewhere along the line, those values got buried under profits and quotas. And that's on me. But what you've done goes beyond policies, Rick. It's a culture you've cultivated here, and it's hurting not just our customers but our employees as well." Rick's expression tightened, but he didn't interrupt. Daniel continued, pointing toward the door that led back to the sales floor. "You've trained this team to believe that closing a deal at any cost matters more than doing right by people. You've shown them that pushing customers into unfair offers isn't just acceptable, it's the standard. And let me tell you something, it's not sustainable. You kill trust, you kill loyalty, and eventually you kill the business." For the first time, Rick looked less sure of himself. His shoulders sagged slightly and his deflection seemed to falter. But he pushed back again, though his voice lacked the same confidence. This is just the way things are done. This is what the competition's doing. You don't win by being soft." "That's where you're wrong," Daniel said, leaning forward again. "You win by standing out, by making people want to come back because they trust you. You win when your employees feel proud of the work they do. That's how you build something that lasts." Rick didn't respond. He dropped his gaze briefly, perhaps realizing there was no point in arguing further. When he looked up again, Daniel's expression had hardened. "Rick," Daniel said, his voice quieter now but no less firm, "your actions have set the tone for this place, and it stops today. I'm letting you go effective immediately." The air in the room felt like it shifted again, heavier this time. Rick's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. But he didn't argue. He simply stood, adjusted his tie, and gave Daniel one last cold stare before walking out without a word. As the door opened, the low hum of the showroom returned, and employees nearest the office glanced over, their expressions a mix of confusion and unease. Whispers passed quickly from desk to desk, though no one dared make eye contact with Rick as he strode toward the exit. Inside the office, Daniel exhaled slowly and stood, running a hand over his face as he processed what had just happened. Through the office window, he could see the employees exchanging nervous glances and murmured comments. Some looked wary, unsure what would come next, while others seemed almost relieved. It was in their body language, the faint ease in their shoulders, the way they didn't shrink back when Daniel stepped out onto the floor moments later. Daniel cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "I know some of you are confused about what just happened," he said, addressing the staff as he scanned their faces. "We'll talk more about that soon. For now, I just want you to know one thing. Things are going to change not just in management but across this whole dealership. I'll be meeting with all of you over the next few days to hear directly from you about the challenges here and how we can fix them together." The tension in the room lifted slightly, not fully, but enough to suggest that his words had landed. As Daniel walked toward the staff meeting room, he noticed one younger salesman, Chris's Tate, then step forward. "Does that mean we're allowed to talk about, stuff like this?" Chris asked tentatively. Daniel paused and turned toward him. "Not only are you allowed to," he said, his tone serious but encouraging, "I expect you to. Starting now." With that, Daniel moved toward his next task. Daniel stood at the center of the room, the hum of conversations falling silent as employees slowly turned toward him. Just days earlier, this same group had watched their sales manager leave the dealership for good, his abrupt firing shredding the unspoken rules they'd grown used to. Now uncertainty hung in the air. Some employees crossed their arms, keeping their expressions neutral, while others leaned against desks, their wariness obvious. For years, their daily focus had been the same: hitting quotas, satisfying management, and minimizing complaints, all while operating in a system that rewarded pushing boundaries. Few here expected things could truly change, and even fewer trusted that whatever came next would stick. Daniel took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room. "Let me start by saying, I know what many of you are thinking," he began, his voice calm but clear, cutting through the tension. "You've probably seen changes come and go over the years, promises made from the top, policies announced, and then nothing. The same grind, the same expectations. You've likely asked yourselves what's different this time." A few employees exchanged glances but said nothing, waiting to hear where this would lead. "The truth is," Daniel continued, "this company lost sight of what really matters. Our customers and you, the people who make this place run." With that, he laid out his plan. Effective immediately, the dealership would implement new policies designed to put customers first. No more hidden fees or aggressive sales tactics. All employees would now have access to new training programs centered on transparency and empathy in customer interactions, with incentives tied directly to customer satisfaction rather than just sales numbers. On paper, these changes sounded positive, but in the room, the reaction was muted, skepticism written across the faces of several staff members. For many, these promises felt like just another round of corporate messaging, nice words that wouldn't survive the pressures of monthly targets. Tim, one of the senior salesmen who had been with the dealership for nearly 20 years, finally spoke up. His graying hair and calm voice carried the weight of his experience. "I've seen a lot of things come through here," he said, his tone steady but cautious. "Managers telling us to push harder, to upsell even if the customer didn't need anything extra. And yet I saw a lot I didn't agree with. But I needed the job. I told myself it wasn't my place to question. But now," he shook his head slightly, "I just don't see how things are going to change for good. How are we supposed to believe this isn't just a PR move?" Daniel nodded, expecting the pushback. "You're right to feel that way, Tim," he replied. "I'd feel the same if I had been in your place. For years, even decades, seeing policies change but never the culture behind them. But that's exactly why this is just policy. It's action, and it starts with holding ourselves accountable for what's already happened. We can't pretend we didn't make mistakes." Over the next week, Daniel began a series of actions no one had seen coming. Whether in his office or seated in the corner of the break room with his laptop, he pulled up old customer complaints and purchase records, identifying those who had been misled or overcharged. Then, one by one, he picked up the phone and called them personally. Some calls were met with confusion at first. Most customers assumed a service representative or junior employee would handle disputes, not the owner of the entire dealership chain. Still, Daniel pressed on. When Rebecca Sanders answered her phone one afternoon, her voice carried the same cautious tone of someone used to bad news. Months earlier, she had purchased a compact SUV from this very dealership, under the impression she had gotten a fair price. But during the paperwork, hidden fees for warranties and loan adjustments had raised her total by nearly $2,000. 0 cents. She had filed a complaint at the time, only to be ignored. "I thought I'd never get my money back," she admitted. Daniel apologized directly, explaining that he had personally reviewed her case and discovered the unethical practices behind her deal. He assured her that a refund would be issued immediately and that changes were being made within the dealership to ensure this never happened again. Rebecca was stunned. In a quiet voice, almost as if unsure she'd been heard correctly, she asked, "You're really fixing this?" These calls didn't go unnoticed by employees. Word spread quickly among the staff. Daniel wasn't just making promises, he was backing them with action. But while some employees began to warm to the idea of real change, others remained hesitant. For years, they'd worked under constant pressure to meet quotas, and many couldn't envision a workplace without that tension. People don't always trust what's different, Payne thought to himself after speaking with one employee who hadn't yet embraced the new focus on transparency. They need to see it in practice before they'll believe it, and they did. Over time, changes weren't just talked about, they started reshaping daily operations. On the sales floor, employees now felt empowered to take time with customers rather than pushing through hurried transactions. For the first time, salespeople were rewarded for solving problems rather than creating them. Transparency around pricing had shifted conversations with customers, and while some interactions were still difficult, the shift was noticeable. As Daniel walked the floor in the evenings, observing his team handle deals, there was a different tone in the air, an atmosphere less rigid, less driven by fear of failure. Still, not everyone adjusted easily. Moments of friction arose, particularly with employees who had thrived under the old system. They felt the pressure of change differently, uncertain whether focusing on customers would ultimately hurt their commissions. Daniel understood those doubts but remained firm. As the weeks went by, he ensured that employees could share their concerns during weekly staff meetings or even through one-on-one discussions with him directly. He was approachable in ways the team hadn't experienced before, and slowly these conversations broke down walls. One afternoon, an unplanned event further demonstrated that change wasn't just a corporate directive, it was real. Rebecca Sanders walked into the dealership, holding onto a folder of her purchase receipts and refund notice. Spotting Daniel from across the showroom, she waved, a cautious but warm smile on her face. Daniel approached her, remembering her story immediately. Rebecca was just here to collect her refund. She wanted to thank him in person. "Honestly," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "when I filed that complaint months ago, I thought it'd disappear into the system." She gestured at the folder in her hands, shaking it gently for emphasis. "I've never had anyone call me from a company like this, let alone the person in charge, and actually care about what happened. You didn't just fix it, you made me feel like I mattered." Employees nearby listened attentively, and Daniel didn't waste the moment. He guided Rebecca toward one of the larger sitting areas where other customers and dealership staff had gathered. Then he spoke as much to his team as to Rebecca. "This is what we're aiming for," Daniel told them, gesturing toward her. "Only doing the right thing when it's convenient, but making things right especially when they're hard. It's about owning up to our mistakes and proving with every interaction that we're committed to fairness." Rebecca's visit left an impact. Employees who might have doubted the sincerity of these changes saw the results firsthand. Moments like these reminded the team that customer-first practices weren't just possible, they were powerful. Rebuilding trust was slow but steady, reshaping the dealership from the inside out. But even as progress appeared on the horizon, change brought resistance from unexpected places. Across town, in the quieter, sprawling lot of Langford Motors, Michael Langford watched the changes at Reeve Automotive with growing irritation. It didn't take long for word to spread about Daniel Reeve's new customer focus and the dramatic steps he was taking to repair his dealership's reputation. Customers were beginning to talk, and Reeve Automotive was transforming into a place where trust seemed to flow back into every transaction. But to Langford, these changes weren't admirable, they were a threat. Langford Motors thrived on what it promised, the cheapest deals around, always. Competitors who tried taking the moral high road didn't last long, not when Langford knew how to undercut them at every turn. Now, as the buzz about Reeve Automotive grew louder, Langford was preparing his. Langford wasn't new to competition. Over the years, he'd built his business by knowing where to cut corners. His formula was simple: offer the lowest prices up front, lock customers into deals before they had second thoughts, and garnish the sale with a welter of hidden fees buried deep in the paperwork. Many buyers didn't even realize how much extra they had paid until weeks later when their first payment statement arrived. By then, it was too late to back out. It wasn't an entirely unique model, but Langford had perfected it. To him, aggressive tactics weren't just a strategy, they were survival in a dog-eat-dog industry. And so, when Reeve Automotive rolled out its sweeping new policies, Langford set his sights on dismantling the budding momentum. He launched an aggressive campaign almost overnight. Billboard ads around town started appearing with bold letters announcing, "Why pay more? Langford Motors has the best deals." At the dealership itself, his sales team began slashing prices, often far below market value, creating a wave of buzz that drew in deal seekers. The strategy was direct, even bold, but not without risk. Langford was betting everything on the short-term appeal of dramatic discounts, knowing it was enough to pull attention away from Reeve Automotive. For customers, the lure of saving a few $1,000s was hard to ignore, regardless of whether the final numbers truly reflected those savings. What mattered was perception. Eternal advertisements framed Langford Motors as the place to go for bargains, while subtle messaging implied that Reeve Automotive's prices, despite their transparency, were far too high. One ad in particular directly targeted Daniel's changes. "Don't pay for nice words, pay for value. Come to Langford Motors." At first, Langford's aggressive tactics worked. Foot traffic to his dealership briefly spiked, and employees scrambled to churn through as many contracts as possible while the momentum lasted. But Langford hadn't anticipated one thing. Comments on social media and local review sites told a different story from the ads plastered across town. Buyers shared experiences of seeing final costs creep up during paperwork, or promises about low-interest financing vanish once terms and conditions were applied. Complaints that Langford Motors had once quietly swept under the rug now resurfaced, amplified by the community's newfound attention on fair practices. Meanwhile, Reeve Automotive wasn't standing still. Unlike Langford, Daniel didn't respond to the price cuts with his own discounts. Doing so would have undermined his commitment to integrity, making it look as though he too was chasing numbers over fairness. Instead, Daniel made a calculated decision to expose Langford Motors' tactics head-on. He rolled out a campaign of his own, but it wasn't based on counter-advertising or pricing wars. Instead, it focused entirely on transparency. "Think you got the best deal?" Daniel's campaign asked customers in bold text, before inviting them to bring their paperwork to Reeve Automotive for a free review. The offer struck a nerve. Daniel knew exactly what he was doing. By encouraging customers to bring in old contracts, especially those from Langford Motors, Daniel wasn't just challenging Langford's pricing claims, he was unraveling the very foundation of the competitor's strategy. For Daniel, this wasn't just about proving a point, it was personal. Customers deserved to know the truth about what they had spent, and Langford Motors had taken shortcuts to win deals, but Daniel was determined to show that shortcuts rarely led to long-term success. The response was immediate. Customers began arriving at Reeve Automotive with stacks of old paperwork in hand. Some had purchased vehicles from Langford Motors years ago, while others were more recent buyers lured in by the competitors' low prices. Daniel's team examined each document painstakingly, explaining line by line where hidden fees had been added, how inflated interest rates had slipped past notice, or how warranties they thought were included had been tacked on as additional charges. For many, it was eye-opening. Customers who had left Langford Motors feeling uneasy about their deals now understood why. One young couple, Jen and Marcus, brought in a contract they had signed just 6 months earlier for a used SUV at Langford Motors. They had been thrilled by the initial price tag, which Langford's team had advertised as unbeatable. But after Daniel's team reviewed the paperwork, the couple learned they had paid nearly $3,000, 0 cents more in hidden fees than the sticker price had suggested. These included extended warranties they hadn't agreed to, inflated loan origination fees, and even a charge for something ambiguously labeled market adjustment. The couple sat stunned as a representative from Reeve Automotives broke it down for them. This is legal?" Marcus asked, frustration clear in his voice. "Legally, yes, but Daniel made it clear this was where ethics diverged from the law." Word spread quickly as more customers shared similar revelations. Online review platforms lit up with customers discussing the discrepancies in their Langford contracts versus what had been promised to them. Stories began circulating not just about Langford's missteps, but about Reeve Automotive's willingness to spotlight those practices. Daniel's strategy hadn't just given customers clarity, it had created a direct contrast between the two dealerships. Langford Motors had become synonymous with misleading deals, while Reeve Automated's transparency earned genuine loyalty. The backlash against Langford Motors deepened. Customers began bringing evidence not only of hidden fees but of patterns of deceit. Some contracts showed discrepancies in monthly payment breakdowns compared to what had been agreed on verbally. Others highlighted unauthorized charges that had seemingly been tacked on with no explanation. Daniel's approach resonated further. These weren't just perceived. The young Mez's efficiency were on a high relaxed rate. Langford's undercutting campaign faltered as traffic at his dealership dwindled. Customers no longer saw Langford Motors as the cheapest option but as a risk, a place where every interaction came with fine print they could no longer trust. Daniel's counter-campaign, highlighting integrity and transparency, turned the narrative in his favor. Customers didn't just leave Langford Motors. They rallied around Reeve Automotive, recommending it to friends and families as the place where fair treatment was guaranteed. This wasn't just a battle between two dealerships. It became a broader discussion about the risks and rewards of ethical business practices. Langford had gambled on short-term gains, hoping misleading deals and heavy advertising could outshine Daniel's reforms. What Langford failed to realize was that the foundation of any business, the trust between a company and its customers, couldn't be sustained by shortcuts. By contrast, Daniel's commitment to fairness had proven one thing clearly: doing the right thing, even when it's harder, builds loyalty that no price war can erase. As Langford Motors found itself under increasing pressure from dissatisfied customers and mounting public scrutiny, Reeve Automotive's transformation gained momentum. But beneath the surface, tensions remained unresolved. Some employees whispered questions about whether Langford would retaliate again. Daniel, focused on the next steps, knew the situation wasn't entirely over. The crowd of reporters shifted closer, cameras and microphones aimed squarely at Daniel as he stood at the podium. For weeks, Reeve Automotive had dominated local news as the story of its transformation spread, but today's press conference carried a heavier tone. To Daniel's right sat a nervous man in a cleaned-up button-down shirt. his posture stiff. His name was Chris Marks, a former salesman from Langford Motor. Before this moment, he had been just another face in Langford's machine, but now he was poised to reveal information that could shake the already fragile foundation of Langford's business. The room buzzed with anticipation. Daniel spoke directly, his voice calm but firm, setting the stage for what would soon unfold. "I promise transparency," he said, making slow, deliberate eye contact with each corner of the room. "And that means sharing the truth, whether it's about my own business or something larger. Today, that truth comes with help." He gestured toward Chris, who swallowed hard, gripping the edges of the table for steadiness. Chris leaned into the microphone, his voice quiet but clear. "I worked at Langford Motors for 5 years," he began, his tone measured but tinged with unease, "and during that time I saw how things were really done." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. The unease in the room thickened as reporters scribbled notes and murmurs passed between them. On list prices, they weren't real numbers. They were set low to bring people in, but once they sat down, the terms changed. Fees would be added at the last minute. Interest rates would shift in the smallest details of the contract, and we were told to make sure customers signed before they noticed. Daniel stood nearby, his expression neutral but his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Chris continued, the words now coming faster. "The pressure to hit quotas made it impossible to be honest. We were told to sell warranties customers didn't ask for new, to talk around loan terms, and to shut down questions if buyers got suspicious." He reached into a folder marked by faint streaks, pulling out a stack of papers and laying them on the table in front of him. "I started keeping records, contracts, memos, outlines for how to handle objections. I didn't know what I'd do with them. I just knew it wasn't right." Chris's testimony, backed by the documents he now shared with reporters, painted a clear and damning picture of Langford's operations. One by one, examples were laid out, hidden adjustments in financing agreements, service packages added without consent, and internal communications encouraging sales staff to prioritize profit over integrity. For Daniel, this wasn't about gloating or gaining the upper hand. It was about giving the public the clarity they deserved. But across town, Michael Langford wasn't about to take the blow quietly. Within an hour of the press conference, Langford Motors released a statement, one filled with sharp accusations and dismissive rhetoric. Langford, ever calculating in his approach, shifted the blame back towards Daniel. In a bold move, he accused Reeve Automotive of running what he called a refund scam, claiming the dealership's sudden pivot to refunds and transparency was just a ploy to drum up new business. "This isn't about integrity," Langford's statement read. "It's about publicity. Daniel Reeve is using these so-called reforms to manipulate public opinion while quietly inflating his own deals in the process." The statement ignited a media frenzy. Anchors debated the merits of Langford's claim, articles popped up dissecting Daniel's recent changes, and social media became a battleground of opinions, both for and against Daniel's motives. Some questioned Daniel's motives, wondering if his efforts were genuine or just a clever form of damage control. Others jumped to his defense, pointing to Langford's well-documented history of cutting corners. The pressure mounted as cameras focused on Daniel during every interaction, waiting for him to stumble or react emotionally. But Daniel refused to buckle under the scrutiny. Choosing not to engage in Langford's mudslinging, he instead held a follow-up press briefing to address the accusations head-on. Standing in front of a backdrop with the simple words, "Transparency is trust," Daniel began. "I'm here to address the accusations made against my dealership," he said plainly, ensuring his tone grounded. His words were chosen carefully, not defensive but deliberate. "Langford is right about one thing. Our business model is different, but it's not a scam. It's called integrity." He went on to describe how his decision to offer refunds and review past contracts wasn't about publicity. It was about fixing what had gone wrong under his watch and preventing future mistakes. "Some might see these actions as a weakness," he said, glancing briefly toward the cameras that zoomed in on his face. "But I see them as strength. Owning up to failures is what allows us to grow. We're not trying to run away from accountability. We're embracing it. His calm demeanor and focus on his message became the turning point. While Langford's accusations relied on sowing doubt, Daniel's response showcased unwavering confidence in his mission. His refusal to sling accusations back at Langford further solidified his image as someone driven not by competition but by genuine values. It wasn't about fighting fire with fire, it was about showing there was no fire to begin with. The public began to rally around Daniel. Customers who had already experienced his dealership's reforms spoke out online, sharing their stories of fair treatment and unexpected refunds. Employees joined in, detailing how the changes at Reeve Automotive had shifted the workplace, questioned Daniel's motives, started to see the larger picture. This wasn't just about one dealership's policies. It was proof that ethical business practices could work, even in an industry often associated with mistrust. Hellion Langford Motors, on the other hand, struggled to maintain control. The whistleblower's testimony had hit harder than expected, and more evidence began surfacing courtesy of current and former employees. Anonymous staff members released documents confirming the fraudulent practices Chris had described, pushing Langford Motors further into crisis. Customers, emboldened by the revelations, brought their complaints to consumer protection groups, demanding answers and refunds. Lawsuits loomed in the distance, adding to the dealership's already worsening reputation. Within weeks, Langford's business entered freefall. Compared to Daniel's steady presence and transparent handling of criticism, Langford now appeared defensive and desperate. His inability to address the mounting accusations with anything but denial only added to his downfall. Eventually, foot traffic at Langford Motors slowed to a trickle, and his once bussy offices grew quieter as customers turned elsewhere. Finally, not even a month after Daniel's press conference, the doors of Langford Motors closed for good. The bright banners advertising best prices in town now hung faded and torn, forgotten by the customers who had once flocked there. The message from the community was clear, even in an industry known for its cutthroat nature. Trust was still a currency people valued, and Langford had run out of it. Daniel's journey wasn't over. The challenges of sustaining Reeve Automotive's transformation still loomed, and the collapse of Langford Motors created a vacuum in the local market. But as Daniel stood in his office that day, reflecting on Langford's downfall, one thing was clear. Integrity wasn't just helpful, it was essential. Daniel Reeve's journey was never about shortcuts. It was about rebuilding a company on the foundation of values he thought had been lost. By refusing to match Langford Motors' cutthroat tactics and instead focusing on honesty, he proved that transparency isn't just a moral choice, it's a practical one. Ethical leadership, in his case, transformed not just a workplace but an entire business model. What happened at Reeve Automotive reminds us that principles can prevail even in competitive industries. Now, consider this. What would change if your own workplace prioritized integrity over shortcuts? Daniel's story shows us it's possible.